Yamiche, let's start with the White House, because Senator Graham says this report is not going to go there before it's made public. I'm wondering what you're hearing about that. And does this mean the administration is not going to try to block any part of this with executive privilege?
Well, the president at the beginning of this said that he thought that the report should be made public. But that was, of course, before he realized that he was cleared on the collusion charge and that Mueller had punted on the issue of obstruction of justice. Since then, Sarah Sanders, the White House press secretary, has said, well, maybe there are issues of executive privilege. She also said maybe we need to try to protect the presidency. Maybe we need to also try to protect these sources by not making this report public. So what you see there is the president still saying, yeah, I'm OK with it if it's OK with William Barr. But in reality, the White House is already hinting that they're willing to walk back the president's initial claims. Now, the sources I've been talking to in the White House say they haven't seen the Mueller report. They have no expectation of seeing it before William Barr is ready to show it to Congress. I also talked to the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, who also told me they're not demanding to see the Mueller report at this time. They're going to wait to make sure that William Barr makes his determination. So I think they're really feeling good about the way that the Mueller report is being covered right now and aren't in a rush to go off and see the full report, because what could happen is you could have something that was like what happened with James Comey when he came out and cleared Hillary Clinton. Even though he cleared her, he used words like reckless and negligent, saying that her behavior was really not the behavior that she should have been taking. So I think that you could see that in the Mueller report. They could say he didn't collude with Russia, but no presidential candidate should be taking meetings with Russian officials offering you dirt on your opponent.
Yeah, this is kind of why, I mean, Giuliani's comments are a little bit puzzling, because Team Trump has this as what they see as an unequivocal win. They've been doing all the messaging on that. But then you have the president's lawyer, Tim, coming out and saying that Mueller is pathetic. I'm trying to figure this out. Is he setting things up in case this report, the full report, isn't as favorable to the president? I mean, we know also that Trump watches when people in his sphere are on television. Is that what the president wanted him to say?
Well, I think, using Rudy Giuliani as a standard for trying to understand how we should think about any of this is a little bit like relying on the carnival barker to understand what's going on at the circus. Well, of course they do, because I think his role for Trump has been to spread smoke screens and to try to pollute people's understanding what the process is about. Mueller said, and Barr quoted him, that the report doesn't fully exonerate the president. They did say that they believe that he was free and clear of the collusion issues. Obstruction of justice has become a muddle in the whole debate, as it should be. Bob Mueller finished his investigation without conducting an interview with the president. Bill Barr certainly didn't conduct an interview with the president on these matters. So the whole issue of intent is up in the air. We don't actually know what Trump himself thought because he wasn't interviewed. And I think that Rudy Giuliani recognizes that as a soft spot in the response to all this. He also recognizes that Bill Barr wrote a brief summary of a voluminous report. So when we speak about the Mueller,
do we know it's voluminous?
Well, it's rumored to be 500 pages. I have to anticipate if they published, they gave the public search warrants that were voluminous. If the search warrants and the underlying documentation in this case are voluminous, the report itself is certain to be voluminous. But Rudy Giuliani is talking about something no one has seen. None of us have the Mueller report yet. If Trump and his advisors believe the report exonerates the president, then make the report public. They have nothing to fear about simply letting it become a public document and letting Congress and voters decide about what's in it.
Well, we're in this little fight now, Caroline, about how quickly we can get this information out there. How long should it take? Let's assume that it is voluminous. Let's assume that it's 500 pages. Is it unreasonable for the Democrats to say you should be able to figure this out by next Tuesday, or is even saying weeks and not months going pretty quickly?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's a safe bet to say that knowing everything that we do about Bob Mueller, this is a voluminous report, to be sure. I think this was a brilliant PR move on the part of Bill Barr to come out with this sort of hot take on the Mueller report immediately, right? People were calling it within 48 hours. So that we as a public had this narrative out there before we get to see the actual report of, the clearing of the conspiracy. That is off the table now. We know that a criminal charge with respect to a conspiracy with the Russians to undermine a free and fair election in the United States is off the table. I agree this obstruction issue is much more difficult, and there is sort of a theory out there that perhaps Mueller wanted to punt this to Congress, and that Bill Barr intercepted it, took it, put his thumb on the scales of justice here, and made that decision for himself. That now is the key question that we're going to be looking for in the Mueller report.
Is that the key thing you're waiting for, Eddie?
Yes, I'm waiting for the Mueller report. Yes, I'm waiting.
But the whole idea that Barr decided he and Rod Rosenstein were going to take a look at this evidence and they were going to make a determination. We don't know whether in that report that's what what Robert Mueller wanted.
Right. I mean, so I think it's important for us not to get ahead of our skis, to wait for the report in its entirety, to understand the underlying evidence, to understand that the DOJ is trying to have its cake and eat it too. Right, because on the one hand, they want to talk about executive privilege. They want to talk about the imperial presidency and limit what can be thought of, what can happen with regards to the president. And on the other hand, they want to limit what is revealed to the Congress, which is supposed to pursue the political process by which they could hold the president accountable. So those things to me are at cross purposes, right? So I think it's important to understand what Adam Schiff is talking about, that there's a counterintelligence investigation that's still being pursued. We have to understand what the chairpersons of the various committees that are investigating the president, what they need in order to do what they need to do. And what we also need to understand that something is happening. When you have on Amazon.com the Mueller report with Alan Dershowitz already having the forward, we know that something is up. And we need to be skeptical.
And we also know it will sell, right? So you may want to play something else that Senator Graham said last night about investigating, that is so amazing, how the entire Mueller investigation got started. Take a listen.
This needs to be looked at. It's going to be looked at, and I'm hoping that Mr. Barr will look at it himself or appoint a special prosecutor. If we don't look at how this accusation against the president came about, then shame on us.
So, Yamiche, is the White House ready to call for a whole new special counsel investigation after trashing the special counsel process?
It's hard to know how serious they are about this line. The president is someone who likes to not only take a victory lap, but then also go after his opponents. I'm thinking back to during the campaign when he was having a debate with Hillary Clinton and said, you know what, I might put you in jail, and this idea that he was going to lock up his opponent. This is kind of under the same line of thinking that not only am I going to now be clear, but I'm not going to go after the people who are looking at me. What we do know, though, that we've learned after the Mueller report, or the summary of the Mueller report has been made public, Lindsey Graham said, John McCain came to me with this dossier and told me, what should I do with it? And Lindsey Graham told John McCain, you should hand it over to the authorities. So put that aside, that Lindsey Graham understands exactly where this dossier and how that got started. How this actually got started was very clear. George Papadopoulos was talking to an Australian official, an Australian diplomat, bragging about the fact that Russia was going to be sharing dirt on Hillary Clinton with the Trump campaign. That Australian official was so alarmed that he then went to the U.S. government, and that's how this got started. So it's in some ways they're playing this game that we know when we know how this got started.
So Caroline, she's talking about your client, and one of the things that immediately came to mind for a lot of people is if the president believes he is totally exonerated, then will he say all the people who got convicted of something as part of this, those were not legitimate prosecutions? So I want to play what your client said to Ari Melber last night.
One, do you stand by your guilty plea?
Yes.
Two, do you want to get a pardon from President Trump?
I'm not asking one. I know my lawyers have formally applied for one. If I'm granted one, I would accept it. It's an honor.
So you have applied for a pardon?
Yes.
Arguing what?
Oh, I'm not going to get into the specific legal arguments of the pardon. I would just say that I think it would be malpractice as a criminal defense attorney not to apply for a pardon, given what we know about this president and this presidency. And a pardon is sort of an extra legal argument, right? You don't need to sort of tick off boxes in terms of whether or not you meet the standard of a pardon. So, you know, George and I have different political beliefs, but we are united in the conviction that there was a taint of fundamental unfairness to this prosecution of him. And so that, you know, the legal arguments are, I will leave to be private, but certainly I think that this is an option on the table for him.
So do you feel good about it, or you think it's a long shot here?
Who knows? I mean, I think that given, we know that President Trump has given a lot of pardons outside of sort of your typical, look, the Office of the Pardon Attorney requires, a 5-year waiting period after having finished your sentence to even apply for a pardon. Obviously, George hasn't met that standard here, but we know that the president is not sort of a typical president in this regard, and that he operates sort of outside of those lines. And so to the extent we're making an argument based on appealing to a sense of fundamental fairness, that's in there.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.